all the way. And then, of course, it wasn't. And then, almost 9 dismal years later, it was over, sort of. It was the Iraq War, and we were the uninvited guests who didn't want to go home. To the last second, despite President Obama's repeated promise that all American troops were leaving, despite an agreement the Iraqi government had signed with George W. Bush's administration in 2008, America's military commanders continued to lobby, and Washington continued to negotiate for 10,000 to 20,000 U.S. troops to remain in country as advisors and trainers. Only when the Iraqis simply refused to guarantee those troops immunity from local law did the last Americans begin to cross the borders into Kuwait. It was only then that our top officials began to hail the thing they had never wanted, the end of the American military presence in Iraq, as marking an era of accomplishment. They also began praising their own quote-unquote decision to leave as a triumph and proclaimed that the troops were departing with, as the president put it, their heads held high. In the final flag-lowering ceremony in Baghdad, clearly meant for U.S. domestic consumption and well attended by the American press corps, but not by Iraqi officials or the local media, Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta spoke glowingly of having achieved ultimate success. He assured the departing troops that they had been a driving force for remarkable progress and that they could proudly leave the country secure knowing that your sacrifice has helped the Iraqi people begin a new chapter in history free from tyranny and full of hope and prosperity and peace. Later on his trip to the Middle East, speaking of the human cost of the war, he added, "I think the price has been worth it." And then the last of those troops really did come home. If you define home broadly enough to include not just bases in the U.S., but also garrisons in Kuwait, elsewhere in the Persian Gulf, and sooner or later in Afghanistan. Then he says that it's true that if you were looking for low-rent victories in a near trillion-dollar war, this time, as various reporters and pundits pointed out, U.S. diplomats weren't rushing for the last helicopter off an embassy roof amid chaos and burning barrels of dollars. In other words, it wasn't Vietnam. And as everyone knew, that was a defeat. In fact, as other articles pointed out, as no fitting word has been found for it, let's go with withdrawal, was a magnificent feat of reverse engineering, worthy of a force that was a non-parallel on the planet. Even the president mentioned it. After all, having seemingly moved much of the U.S. to Iraq, leaving was no small thing. When the U.S. military began stripping the 505 bases it had built there at the cost of unknown multi-billions of taxpayers' dollars, it slaughtered off $580 million of no longer wanted equipment on the Iraqis. And yet it still managed to ship to Kuwait, other Persian Gulf garrisons, Afghanistan, and even small towns in the U.S., more than 2 million items ranging from Kevlar armor vests to porta potties. We're talking about the equivalent of 20,000 truckloads of material. Not surprisingly, given the society it comes from, the U.S. military fights a consumer-intensive style of war. And so, in purely commercial terms, the leaving of Iraq was a withdrawal for the ages. Nor should we overlook the trophies the military took home with it, including a vast Pentagon database of thumbprints and retinal scans from approximately 10% of the Iraqi population. A similar program is still underway in Afghanistan. When it came to success, Washington had a good deal more than that going for it. After all, plans to maintain a Baghdad embassy so gigantic it puts the Saigon embassy of 1973 to shame. With a contingent of 16 to 18,000 people, including a force of perhaps 5,000 armed mercenaries provided by private security contractors like Triple Canopy, with its $1.5 billion State Department contract, the mission leaves any normal definition of embassy or diplomacy in the dust. Anyway, the whole thing is just, showing you how the situation of the U.S. in terms of its wars, was really a defeat. And he says here finally, for Washington, if the guerrillas it opposes go to war with little more than the clothes on their backs, its military is another matter. For Washington, if the guerrillas it opposes go to war with little more than the clothes on their back, its military is another matter. From meals to body armor, building supplies to ammunition, it needs a massive and massively expensive supply system. It also guzzles fuel the way a drunk downs liquor, and has spent more than $20 billion in Afghanistan and Iraq annually just on air conditioning. To keep itself in good shape, it must rely on tortuous supply lines thousands of miles long. Because of this, it is not the arbiter of its own fate in Afghanistan, though this seems to have gone almost unnoticed for years. Of all the impractical wars a declining empire could fight, the Afghan one may be the most impractical of all. Let's see. For the nearly 91,000 American troops now in that country, their 40,000 NATO counterparts, and thousands of private contractors, the supplies that make the war possible can only enter Afghanistan three ways. Perhaps 20% comes in by air at staggering expense. More than a third arrive by the shortest and cheapest route through the Pakistani port of Karachi, by truck or train north, and then by truck across narrow mountain defiles, and perhaps 40% only non-lethal supplies via the Northern Distribution Network. And the Northern Distribution Network was developed only beginning in 2009, when it later became clear to Washington that Pakistan had a potential stranglehold on the American war effort. Involving at least 16 countries and just about every form of transport imaginable, the Northern Distribution Network is actually three routes, two of them via Russia. That, in other words, funnels just about everything through the bottleneck of corrupt, autocratic Uzbekistan. In other words, simply to fight this war, Washington has made itself dependent on the kindness of strangers, in this case, Pakistan and Russia. It's one thing when a superpower or great power on the rise casts its lot with countries that may not be natural allies. It's quite a different story when a declining power does so. So anyway, it was estimated, for instance, that in 2008, 12% of all U.S. supplies headed for Karachi to Bagram Air Base went missing somewhere en route. And what Karachi's police chief has called the mother of all scams, 29,000 cargo loads of U.S. supplies have disappeared after being unloaded at that port. In fact, the whole supply system, together with the local security and protection agreements and bribes to various groups that are part and parcel of it along the way, has evidently helped fund and supply the Taliban, as well as stocking every bazaar on the route and supporting local warlords and crooks of every sort. In other words, this is the empire. And the empire is in big trouble. And it's a whole era of decline of empire and rise of revolutionary struggle. That is what this conference on today celebrates. 36 years of solidarity. That is nothing to laugh at. And as I said, you had to have some kind of vision. See, these people who are writing now, Pat Buchanan and the rest of them, Penny Heskin say, I told you so, I could have told you. You didn't have to wait this long to know that this was coming, right? And because to have moved when we did move, at a time, you know what I'm talking about, when people laughed at us, do you remember that? You know, laughed at a solidarity movement because white people can't, quote unquote, work against their own interests, as though it's in the interest of white people to maintain the status quo. When, you know, nationalists, you know, criticized us for having this kind of relationship, and they were all silly. You know, they said, well, you trust them white people? I said, well, it's not a matter of trusting the white people. It's about trusting our strategy. We don't trust you either, but we got a strategy. We got a strategy. We know when you're wrong. We know when they're wrong. That's what it's about, you see? And so we're building a revolutionary movement, and now, after so many years of solidarity, this nature of the solidarity is also going to be changing and transforming. Because part of what you've done over the years with the solidarity that you have expressed has made it possible for us to keep a revolutionary movement alive, has made it possible for us to be in all the different places that we've been in to forward the revolutionary movement. Now we're at a place where all the resources that we get have to begin to go toward building the capacity of the party for self-determination. This is, and this is what arms us better than anything else to carry out the mission that this moment in history requires of all of us. Thank you so much, Uhuru.
One nation!
One nation!
One Africa!
Uhuru!
Uhuru!